Thank you for being here. Good morning. I'm pleased to call this Subcommittee on Taxation and IRS Oversight to order. I want to thank Ranking Member Thune for his partnership on this hearing, also for the partnership for his staff, along with the colleagues who are going to join us throughout the day. We've got a voting schedule this morning, so people will probably be in and out. But I am thrilled to have the panel that we have today to discuss the 25-year-old child tax credit and its benefit to tens of millions of American children. Over its history, this tax credit, which is the single largest federal expenditure in kids, has made it easier for families to afford rent, groceries, child care, and the thousands of other expenses that come with raising a child in America. At its best, the child tax credit has lifted nearly 2 million children out of poverty and demonstrated that we don't have to accept, in the wealthiest country in the world, that the highest levels, one of the highest levels of childhood poverty in the industrialized world as a permanent feature of our economy and our democracy. In today's testimony, we'll learn much more about the history of the child tax credit and its success. And although there have been occasional differences in approach between the two parties, I think it's important to recognize that the child tax credit has been expanded both in size and to whom it's been made available as a result of bipartisan consensus and agreement. Indeed, I want to record here that among the first lawmakers to officially embrace the CTC were Republican members of the House in 1994, who included a $500 credit in Newt Gingrich's contract with America. And it was President George W. Bush who worked with both Democrats and Republicans in Congress to make some of the child tax credit refundable for the first time, expanding some of the benefit to low-income families. In 2017, Congress passed the Trump tax cuts without bipartisan support. That bill doubled the maximum size of the credit from $1,000 to $2,000, but it also made it more available to wealthier families by increasing the income threshold to $200,000 for individuals and $400,000 for married couples. And around the same time, my colleague Sherrod Brown and I took a different approach and introduced the American Family Act. That bill made the child tax credit fully refundable, cutting taxes for the poorest families and the middle class. And we did that because no child chooses to be born poor, but as our witnesses will tell you today, growing up in poverty can shape a child's future and the country's future in ways that are profoundly unfair. I saw the effect of that poverty every single day when I worked for the children in the Denver public schools as their superintendent. And as a society, we've paid the price. Child poverty costs our country up to $1 trillion a year in the form of more hospital visits, lower earnings, and higher crime. And that's why economists from across the political spectrum agree that investing in our kids is one of the best choices we can make for our country. According to Columbia University, every dollar we invest in the expanded child tax credit guarantees $9 in benefits to society down the road. And when COVID exacerbated and revealed further inequities in our economy, we passed the American Family Act as part of the American Rescue Plan. And we'll hear today that unlike many things the federal government attempts, it was an enormous success. As the research predicted, 62 million kids benefited, 90% of kids in every single state. In Colorado, moms spent it on things like groceries and rent and diapers and textbooks. It reduced stress for kids and for their parents, and it helped cut childhood poverty in half and hunger by a quarter. We found out that an extra $10 a day didn't actually reduce workforce participation, as some people have said. There is a growing chorus of research now, some of which our witnesses will share today, that shows the expanded child tax credit is pro-family, pro-work, and pro-democracy. For 6 shining months in 2021, we finally treated children in poverty in this country like they were our children, not someone else's children. But we failed to extend the child tax credit, the expanded child tax credit, and now, because of that failure, child poverty is rising again in America. Child hunger is rising again in America, and American children continue to go to bed hungry in the richest country in the world. Today, I hope we'll have a discussion about why we should move forward in a bipartisan way to make the full expanded credit available to every kid in America. We should consider how extraordinary it would be for the wealthiest country in human history, with the fourth highest rate of child poverty among rich nations as we meet here this morning, was able, in the end, to end childhood poverty, to have an economy that when it grows for everybody, not just the people at the very top. My hope is that in the months ahead, we'll build on 25 years of child tax credit expansions to support America's children. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague and the ranking member, Senator John Thune, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bennet, and to you and your staff for working, and to all our panelists for being here today to examine and further explore this important issue. Today we are here to discuss the child tax credit and evaluate its 25-year history, review its effectiveness in helping to ease the financial burden on American families, and to discuss modifications to the credit that Congress should consider. In 1997, the child tax credit was created as a $400 non-refundable per child tax credit intended to help make life a little easier for working families and children. I was a member of the House of Representatives at the time. As Chairman Bennet pointed out, at that time Speaker Gingrich was part of the agenda among House Republicans. Bill Archer was the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and the child tax credit was born. Over the last 25 years, the child tax credit has expanded and evolved, and unlike some issues that we debate in this committee, it continues to have a fair amount of bipartisan support. Today, as a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the credit provides qualifying families with $2,000 per dependent child and $500 per non-dependent child up to the age of 16. And due to this expansion of the child tax credit, families across the nation are able to reap the benefits of a more lucrative credit. However, this expanded child tax credit is set to expire and revert back to pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act levels beginning in 2026. If allowed to happen, families in South Dakota and across the nation would see their child tax credit benefit cut in half and back to the 2017 levels. Therefore, it's my hope that my colleagues on the Finance Committee and the Senate see the necessity for this expanded child tax credit to not be allowed to simply expire in just a few short years. As we all know, there is a push by some to reinstate the temporary changes to the child tax credit that were included in the American Rescue Plan in 2021 and have since expired. This is an approach that I have serious concerns with, as do many others, including some of our witnesses. The American Rescue Plan went beyond simply increasing the per-child tax credit amount. It extended the credit to children who are almost adults. It adopted a completely new approach by mandating taxpayers who did not opt out to receive half their credit in advance, significantly straining the IRS's resources and leading to refund delays, surprise tax bills, and lengthy call wait times for 2 consecutive tax filing seasons, among a host of other administrative challenges. Though we can debate the merits of any of these changes, in my view, the most concerning change was that Democrats eliminated the credit's tie to working and earning a basic amount of income. This single change essentially turned a credit that targets assistance toward working families into universal basic income for anyone with a child. This contentious and expensive change is also completely contrary to the original intent of the child tax credit. Eliminating the tie between the child tax credit and working takes away a key incentive, a bonus of sorts for certain parents to enter and to stay in the workforce. Such an incentive has been part of the child tax credit since its inception, and one that is lauded in other income support programs such as the Earned Income Tax Credit. Today, while many try to reframe the discussion, the child tax credit originated during the broader back-to-work welfare reform push of the 1990s and cannot be understood without comprehending the lessons of this highly successful series of reforms. One primary objective of welfare reform was to get families out of the cycle of perpetual poverty by providing them with a hand up rather than a handout. That is why the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunities Reconciliation Act incorporated work requirements into various federal programs. These changes were decried by some at the time as being unfair or mean-spirited and likely to lead to harm for those who need assistance. In fact, The data is irrefutable to the contrary. Welfare reform worked and had amazing and positive outcomes for the most economically vulnerable. By tying government assistance to workforce participation, beneficiaries of various federal programs are incentivized to get a job, which provides the best pathway out of poverty and a host of other positive outcomes. Clearly, there are certain instances in which a parent does not have the ability to work, but there are current programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit and WIC that do not require one to hold a job, I should say, in order to reap the full benefits of the program. However, turning the child tax credit into universal basic income is both duplicative and counterproductive. And I believe this is the wrong approach. Instead, I believe that it is imperative for Congress to ensure that we continue to build on the successes of the child tax credit that we've witnessed over its 25-year history, rather than fixing what is not broken. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on this very important issue, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Thune, for that excellent opening statement. And with that, I'm going to introduce the witnesses. Let me introduce first Mr. Dutta-Gupta, who's the President and Executive Director of the Center for Law and Social Policy, a nonpartisan anti-poverty nonprofit focused on advancing policy solutions to improve the lives of people with low incomes. Prior to joining CLASP, he was the co-executive director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, where he led work to develop policy recommendations focused on poverty and inequality, advancing racial and gender equity, and advancing economic inclusion. Earlier in his career, Mr. Dutta-Gupta served as a professional staff member on the House Ways and Means Committee for the Subcommittee on Income Security and Family Support. He received his BA with honors from the University of Chicago in Law, Letters, and Society, and in Political Science, and was selected as a Harry S. Truman Scholar. Professor Catherine Mitchell-Moore is an Associate Professor of Public Policy at the University of Michigan's Gerald Ford School of Public Policy. Professor Mitchell-Moore is a leading scholar and educator on the social safety net, education policy, labor economics, and economic demography. She is a recognized expert on the efficacy of the Earned Income Tax Credit and its impact on children. She completed her PhD in Policy Analysis and Management at Cornell University. She holds a BA in Economics and Psychology from Wesleyan University. Dr. Kevin Corinth is a Senior Fellow and the Deputy Director of the Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility at the American Enterprise Institute. Before joining the AEI, Dr. Corinth served as the Staff Director of the Joint Economic Committee in Congress and Chief Economist in the White House's Council of Economic Advisors. Dr. Corinth has a PhD and an MA in Economics from the University of Chicago. He holds a BA in Economics and Political Science from Boston College. And last but not least, Dr. Angela Rashidi is a Senior Fellow and a Rose Scholar in Opportunity and Mobility Studies, also at the American Enterprise Institute, where she studies poverty and the effects of federal safety net programs on low-income people in America. Before joining AEI, Dr. Rashidi researched benefit programs for low-income populations in New York City. From 2007 to 2015, she served as a deputy commissioner in the New York City's Department of Social Services, where she oversaw the agency's policy research and program evaluation efforts. She received her PhD from the New School, an MPA from Northern Illinois University, and a BS in Public Administration from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. I am extremely grateful to have all of you here today for this hearing. Mr. Dutta-Gupta, Professor Mitchell-Moore, Dr. Corinth, and Dr. Rashidi. I look forward to your testimony. And with that, I think we're going to go to Mr. Dutta-Gupta. As a reminder, we ask each of you to keep your testimony to 5 minutes each, and any written testimony will be submitted for the record. You might hear me tap the gavel should your time expire. Mr. Dutta-Gupta, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bennet, Ranking Member Thune, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Indivar Dutta-Gupta, and I'm President and Executive Director of the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP. I'm honored to come before you to discuss the bipartisan, quarter-century history and extraordinary track record of the child tax credit. I've been working on policies to reduce poverty for nearly 2 decades. As professional staff on the Ways and Means Committee from 2007 through 2010, I worked on a bipartisan basis to reduce the tax credit's discriminatory treatment against people when their incomes are low. We succeeded in shrinking the earnings that are not counted toward the credit from around $11,000 a year to $3,000 a year. Later, I worked at think tanks and advanced a more effective CTC. The child tax credit was established through the Taxpayer Relief Act of 1997. The credit was the culmination of recommendations made by the National Commission on Children that were embraced by both Republicans and Democrats. The first CTC was modest and was non-refundable. Over the next 2 decades, the CTC was strengthened. The benefit grew to $1,000 per child and was made partially refundable in the first large tax package signed by President George W. Bush. However, the CTC ignored the first $10,000 in earnings, so a full-time minimum wage worker with 2 children received just $45. She would not get the full credit until she worked the equivalent of more than 2 full-time minimum wage jobs. During the 2007 through 2009 financial crisis, bipartisan legislation lowered the earnings threshold to $3,000 temporarily, so this minimum wage worker could now receive $1,725. On a bipartisan basis, this provision was extended multiple times and then made permanent in 2015 alongside various corporate tax cuts, including the R&D tax credit. President Trump's 2017 tax law increased the credit to $2,000 per child and lowered the earnings threshold to $2,500. In 2021, the American Rescue Plan Act's child tax credit 1-year expansion led to all-time lows in child poverty as well as in racial disparities in child poverty, with little or no undesirable effects. Key to this impact was full refundability, which helped include those families that would most benefit from an income boost and ensure that they got an equal benefit. Unfortunately, policymakers didn't extend this historic investment, and millions of families have struggled as a result. The United States is the only Western industrialized nation that doesn't have a child allowance policy or some other universal public benefit for families raising children. Those are not my words, but the words of the 1991 National Commission on Children, which included 12 Reagan and Bush appointees. These appointees unanimously recommended something like the American Rescue Plan's child tax credit. At the end of 2025, major provisions of the Trump tax law, including those that expanded the child tax credit, expire. This creates an opportunity to establish and improve CTC, drawing on decades of evidence. A vast array of rigorous studies has demonstrated that the child tax credit and similar policies help families with low incomes provide a foundation for their children to thrive. Here are a few examples. Children whose mothers received payments from the Mother's Pension Program a century ago lived 1 year longer, obtained 1/3 more years of schooling, were less likely to be underweight, and had higher income in adulthood compared to children whose mothers' applications were rejected. A study of pandemic-era stimulus and child tax credit payments found that each additional $100 in unconditional transfers that a pregnant mother received reduced the prevalence of low birth weight, which can have lifelong effects, by 2 to 3%. A study looking at birth and tax years found that an extra $1,000 tax transfer to low-income families with children result in 2.6% fewer referrals to Child Protective Services through age 2 and 7.9% fewer days spent in foster care. The child tax credit provides such unequivocally positive outcomes because each of us needs a basic foundation to develop fully and thrive. A modest income floor allows parents to invest more in their children and reduce their own stress, in turn likely improving parent-child interactions. An expansive child tax credit offers enormous gains. Researchers calculate that a permanent version of the ARPA child tax credit would return more than $9 to society for each dollar spent, with little to no harmful consequences. If policymakers can come together and establish a permanent and equitable child tax credit, our entire nation will become more just and prosperous.
Thank you, Mr. Dutta-Gupta. Appreciate very much your testimony. Dr. Mitchell-Moore, thank you.
Chairman Bennet, Ranking Member Thune, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm an associate professor at the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, but I'm here on my own behalf, and the views expressed here are my own and should not be attributed to my institution. My testimony today will provide an overview of the children left out of the current law, child tax credit, as well as the impacts of the historical American Rescue Plan Act, reform to the child tax credit, and the likely enormous long-term societal benefits of making these reforms permanent. As Chairman Bennet said, the child tax credit is the single largest federal expenditure program for children in the U.S. Despite its scope, the current structure of the CTC prevents approximately 19 million of the poorest children in the U.S. from receiving the full credit. In fact, nearly all children living in the bottom 10% of the income distribution are not eligible for any CTC benefit. In contrast, nearly all children residing in the households in the top half of the income distribution are eligible for the full benefit. Excluding the poorest children in the U.S. from the child tax credit goes against the evidence that we have about the importance of income for children's future life chances. An extra dollar matters the most for kids living in the poorest households. Eligibility for the CTC is racially and geographically concentrated. As of 2023, nearly half of Black and more than 1/3 of Hispanic children resided in households that were not eligible for the full credit, compared to just 17% of white children. Likewise, children living in the rural areas and coming from larger families are also less likely to receive the full benefit. To give a few concrete examples, as Mr. Dutta-Gupta said, a single earner family with 2 children working full-time year-round at the federal minimum wage would not be eligible for the full CTC. Such a family would need to earn more than $30,000 per year to qualify for the full benefit, which is well above the official poverty threshold and more than twice the earnings of someone working full-time year-round at the federal minimum wage. In contrast, under current law, a married couple with annual earnings of $400,000 would qualify for the full $2,000 per child benefit. In fact, nearly all children residing in households in the top half of the income distribution are eligible for the full benefit, while more than 1/4 of the poorest children in the U.S. are not. The 2021 ARPA reform to the CTC marked a critical moment in CTC legislative history, transforming the benefit into something akin to a universal child allowance. The growing body of evidence on the impact of the reforms suggests that they had real positive impacts on the well-being of families, particularly low-income working families. Survey evidence suggests that families spent their benefit primarily on basic needs, such as food and housing, as well as child-related items, and paying down debt. The Census Bureau estimates that child poverty declined by nearly half in 2021, keeping nearly 3 million children out of poverty. Following the expiration of the monthly payments in 2022, estimates suggested that 3.7 million more children were living below the poverty line. Other measures of material hardship also improved during the months that the CTC was in place. Material hardships, including food insecurity and housing hardships, declined substantially. Evidence also suggests that the CTC reduced child maltreatment in the days following the payments and increased infant birth weight. Both of these outcomes have been shown to lead to longer-term improvements in child outcomes. One of the central debates about making the ARPA reforms to the CTC permanent at the end of 2021 was surrounding how the reforms might reduce parents' incentives to work. However, the vast majority of research on the reforms found no evidence that the credit caused parents to work less, with survey evidence suggesting that the credit actually helped some parents work more by allowing them to afford the necessary costs associated with work, such as childcare and transportation. While it's too soon to tell how these reforms will benefit children in the long term, history tells us that the societal benefits are likely to be enormous. A recent study by researchers at Columbia University estimated that the $97 billion spent on the expanded CTC could generate $929 billion in long-term societal benefits, a return on investment of more than 9 to 1. These calculations were based on a long line of research that points to the importance of income for children's success in both the short and long term. For instance, children who receive more income in early childhood through tax credits, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, and other social programs like food stamps, go on to have higher test scores in school, have better health outcomes, complete college at higher rates, and have higher earnings in adulthood. They're also less likely to live in poverty and less likely to receive public assistance in adulthood. In short, the evidence is clear that a permanent expansion of the CTC is likely to pay off several times over for both the beneficiaries themselves as well as society at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Corinth, you have 5 minutes.
Chairman Bennet, Ranking Member Thune, and subcommittee members, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. The child tax credit, the version that we have today, should be celebrated as a bipartisan achievement because it serves the dual purpose of providing tax relief for families and encouraging work. Since it was introduced 25 years ago, the child tax credit has become more generous and has been expanded to more working families, including to those who don't earn enough to pay federal income tax. Today, for a full-time worker with 2 children, the child tax credit effectively turns a $15 per hour job into a $17 per hour job, increasing take-home pay by $4,000 over the course of a year. Rewarding work through the tax code has been shown to increase employment, especially for low-income families. It also improves the well-being of children, who not only perform better academically in the short run, but also achieve higher earnings and greater self-sufficiency when reaching adulthood. In short, incentivizing work through the tax code, as the child tax credit has done for almost its entire 25 years of existence, is a proven strategy for increasing employment, reducing poverty, and investing in the long-run success of children. However, for 6 months during 2021, the child tax credit was completely changed. Instead of offsetting taxes and rewarding work, it was transformed into a universal child allowance, costing an additional $100 billion annually. If made permanent, it would lead an estimated 1.5 million parents to exit the workforce and could put at risk the long-run benefits for children that result from the existing child tax credit. Unfortunately, the risks of adopting a child allowance have been overlooked. The intellectual foundation for this idea was provided in part by a National Academy of Sciences report in 2019. That report concluded that replacing the child tax credit with a child allowance would have a negligible effect on employment and thus dramatically reduce child poverty. However, the report made a fundamental error. It failed to recognize that the work incentives in the existing child tax credit would be eliminated. When my co-authors and I corrected the error and used their own assumptions about how parents respond to work incentives in other contexts, we found that well over 1 million parents would exit work due to the policy change. Unfortunately, the National Academy of Sciences has been unwilling to correct the public record about their error, misleading policymakers about the true consequences of their decisions. Policymakers are now being misled again by faulty interpretations of studies that examine the 2021 experience with the child allowance. These studies test whether parents who received the child allowance during the second half of 2021 were more likely to quit their jobs. But contrary to assertions, these studies do not provide a useful guide to the effects of making the child allowance permanent. There are 3 main reasons. First, it's hard to believe that most parents understood how work incentives changed in 2021 when the child allowance checks were being paid out. As late as September of that year, 462 economists wrote a letter to Congress in which they failed to recognize that the child tax credit's work incentives were eliminated. It's unrealistic to think that most parents would have understood more quickly. In fact, previous research suggested it would take several years for employment responses to fully materialize. Second, parents would have been less likely to quit their jobs in response to a temporary 6-month policy change. In real-world labor markets, workers cannot suddenly quit their jobs, then automatically get them back 6 months later when the work incentives are restored. Third, even if parents understood the weakened work incentive more quickly than 462 economists, and even if they had jobs they could seamlessly move into and out of, the 2021 experience would still provide little help in understanding the consequences of a permanent extension of a child allowance. That's because a lot was going on in 2021 that made it unique. How parents respond to work incentives in the midst of a pandemic and other unprecedented government aid is likely to differ from how they would respond in less extreme times. While these issues may sound obvious, some have nonetheless extrapolated from the experience with the 2021 child allowance to what would happen if it was made permanent. They have claimed that we now have evidence that it would have little effect on employment and thus dramatically reduce child poverty. That is simply not true. The existing child tax credit follows a proven strategy for increasing work, reducing poverty, and investing in children's long-run success. Replacing it with a child allowance would provide more resources to low-income families in the short run, but at the same time threaten self-sufficiency and children's well-being in the long run. As you discuss ways to better support families, I hope that you consider both the benefits and the costs of possible policy changes. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Testimony as well. Dr. Rashidi, you get the last word for the moment.
Chairman Bennet, Ranking Member Thune, and subcommittee members, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Angela Rashidi, and I am a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, or AEI. My research at AEI focuses on the intersection of safety net policy and employment as a path out of poverty. I want to make three key points in assessing the history of the child tax credit. First, Congress created the CTC as a credit against federal income taxes owed by working families with children, complementing the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, which primarily benefits low-income families, working families who do not owe federal income taxes. Second, over the years, Congress has expanded the refundability of the CTC, meaning that it now substantially overlaps with the EITC and other safety net benefits, a fact that is frequently overlooked. Finally, proposals to turn the CTC into a child allowance are not targeted well to low-income families, and these proposals jeopardize progress made in the U.S. on child poverty. The CTC started in 1997 as a modest $500 per child non-refundable tax credit for working families as a way to offset some of their federal income and payroll tax liability. Through several expansions, it is now partially refundable. Key design features include that it phases in at 15% of earnings above $2,500 per year, which incentivizes employment. The CTC works in conjunction with the fully refundable EITC, which operates in a similar way but targets low-income working families without federal income tax liability. Approximately 86% of the EITC is refundable, while 39% of the CTC is refundable. This brings me to another often overlooked point. By increasing the refundability of the CTC over the years, policymakers have added this transfer payment on top of the existing safety net. For example, under current law, the typical working single mother with 2 children earning $12 per hour for full-time work would receive the refundable EITC, refundable CTC, and SNAP benefits, totaling more than $12,000 in government benefits per year alone and increasing her income by 50%. Her children would likely also receive free school lunches, health insurance through Medicaid, and the family could receive housing and child care assistance, averaging another several $1,000s per year. Non-working families could receive SNAP, SSI, free school lunch, TANF, and other benefits. The safety net I just described is most generous for parents when they work. The refundable EITC and CTC phase in with earnings and do require some employment to maintain eligibility. Studies have documented the many positive effects associated with this design. We cannot rely on the 2021 temporary CTC expansion to understand how a permanent child allowance would affect outcomes due to it being a temporary policy, and because the research suffered from the inability to study the policy in a controlled environment. For these reasons, we should look to other research to suggest how an expanded CTC might affect families over the long term. One recent study tested an unconditional cash payment for a group of randomly assigned families with a new baby. Called Baby's First Years, the study produced mixed results. Although there was no statistical difference in whether a mother worked or not at the time of surveys, the payments did reduce full-time employment by 11% across 3 years and hours worked by 12%. This demonstrates the importance for policymakers of taking seriously concerns over how government payments affect employment. My final point is that turning the CTC into a universal child allowance does not target poverty well, which is likely why studies in other countries have found that universal child benefits fail to improve long-term outcomes. For example, economist James Heckman studied universal child benefits in Denmark and concluded that although redistribution did decrease income inequality, it failed to close achievement and skill gaps. Proposals for a child allowance in the U.S. would similarly target low-income families poorly. The Penn-Wharton budget model found that a 2021 type CTC expansion would distribute only 50% of new benefits to those in the bottom 2 income quintiles. To conclude, proposals to move the CTC away from its original goals of tax relief threaten the country's progress on poverty by discouraging employment and mistargeting important federal benefits. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rashidi, and thank you to all of you for your excellent testimony. I think Senator Thune has to run across the street. I'm trying to filibuster here with the folks that are here until he comes back. But thank you for the witnesses. I think you guys have done a really good job of delineating the different views of this. So let's get into this conversation. And Dr. Mitchell-Moore, I think I'll start with you. Professor Mitchell-Moore, I think I'll start with you. I think we could spend the whole 2 hours here going over the research that proves the expanded CTC doesn't discourage work and the effects on poverty and hunger and parental stress, or even children's visits to the emergency room. But there are people, as we've heard, and who are citing studies that suggest that it will discourage people from working. I do want to say, Dr. Corinth, and I'm happy to get you into this too, that I did not rely on that 2019 study when Sherrod Brown and I wrote this bill in 2017. That was 2 years before. So if there were other people relying on it, it wasn't me. And it certainly didn't inform my opinion about whether this was a good policy or not. But I think, just based on the conversations I have with moms, mostly in Colorado, that some of these critics are living in an imaginary world, you know, in a world where a mom who's making $2,000 a month as a janitor, you know, who already can't afford the $1,300 a month for a two-bedroom apartment and $900 a month for childcare, you know, in this imaginary world, she quits her job paying $2,000 a month because she starts receiving $250 a month from the child tax credit. In reality, parents can't afford to work because it's too expensive to pay for child care in America. That's not, I don't think, just my opinion. I hear it every single day in Colorado. So I wonder, Dr. Mitchell-Moore, if you could help clear this up. Is there any evidence about the effect of the expanded child tax credit on work? And could you explain how it actually, in some cases, helps families work more?
Thank you for the question. The vast majority of the evidence we have to date suggests that, or found no evidence that the monthly payments reduce parents' employment. And so while we can't say for sure whether these effects would persist, it's not clear that parents knew that the credits were going to expire. I think many of us did not know the credits would expire until late in the year. And lots of survey evidence does show, as you mentioned, that it actually helped parents work more by allowing them to afford childcare and transportation. A survey by AEI actually found that the vast majority of parents said that the credit wouldn't impact their employment at all. And equal shares said it helped them work more as those that said it would help them work less.
Dr. Corinth, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I would just add that there's a large literature in the economic literature finding that tax credits that incentivize work do, in fact, increase work. And I don't think we can rely on the temporary 2021 experience.
Yeah. And I appreciated your testimony about that, too, because it was different than other testimony that we've heard in front of this committee where people actually imagined, I'm sitting in your seat, that there were families out in America watching the committee debate over the expanded child tax credit and retreating from the labor market as a result of that debate. I think your testimony is different from that, which is that the tax credit, it was too short a period, and maybe in 2021, and maybe there was too much else in the environment to be able to tell. I think there's pretty convincing evidence on the other side, but I do want to say that testimony is different from what we've had before, and I'll come back to you if you want to respond to any of that. I do have one other question I'd like to ask at the outset, and since for once I've got the chairman's gavel, I'm going to do that even though I may go over time slightly, Senator. You know, the part of the expanded child tax credit that Sherrod Brown and I worked on that's raised the most debate is what we call full refundability, which simply means that families get the credit even if their income taxes are less than the credit. And Mr. Dutta-Gupta, this question is going to go for you. We know, first of all, if you look up here, that more than 70% of the people that received the fully refundable credit were working. I think that's a really important point. 7 out of 10 were working. If you look at people that were working the year before, that number is actually more than 80% of the people that were getting the refundable tax credit were working. And if you look at the rest of the people that are there, there's 95% that are either working, so the vast majority working. If you want to take just the year of the credit, more than 70%. If you want to take the year before, there were people working and who may have fallen out of the workforce, which is not unusual. I mean, people do that all the time. That's more than 80%. And then you add up people with a child under the age of 2, as Senator Thune said when he was here, maybe there's the opportunity for us to think about people with very young children and whether we'd be happier incentivizing them to work or happier incentivizing them to try to raise children. There are people living with children, living with senior citizens, and their children living with disabled people. If you operate all of that, grandparents, people who have a baby, people who are disabled, that's 90% of the families that benefited from the fully refundable credit. I would argue that that 95%, you can't make a case that they're being disincentivized from working because they're either working or because they've got a really good excuse for not working. And nevertheless, we took this credit away from people that were working. And in doing that, and I'm going to put this in the record later when I have the chance to do it, over 700,000 janitors and housekeepers who do backbreaking work now have lost the benefit of the full refundability of the credit, the marginal improvement to their income that they were getting as a result of the credit. Over 700,000 cooks, waitresses, farmers, and ranchers who feed this country. Almost 600,000 teachers and child care workers who educate and care for their kids. They got the benefit of full refundability. Today they don't have the benefit, and it's not because they're not working. Over 500,000 health care aides and nurses who take care of America's sick and elderly. Over 400,000 construction workers who are building this country. And this is a list from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that I'm going to enter into the record. And as I said, we've also taken away from grandparents who worked for 50 years and now probably for circumstances beyond their own control are helping to raise their grandchildren, the mom of one-year-olds who are paying more for child care than they will ever make, you know, if they are working. But notwithstanding all of that, and I think there are probably people on the other side of the aisle who would say that sounds unjust and counterproductive. Notwithstanding all of that, somebody who makes $400,000 in America gets the full $2,000 credit for every kid they have. Talk about something that's misallocated or mistargeted or misspent. So Dr. Dutta-Gupta, could you talk more about who's lost out from the expiration of the enhanced child tax credit? Could you explain, why it makes sense that we live in a world where someone making $400,000 gets the full credit for every child that they have, and that people who are struggling to survive, the vast majority of whom are working, don't get the full credit?
Well, I'm not going to make sense of that world, but I will say that you're exactly right. By making that tax credit fully refundable for 1 year, we kept nearly 3 million families out of poverty. This particularly helped a lot of families of color, Black, Latino. We're talking about nearly half of Black children and 2 in 5 Latino children who did not get the full child tax credit prior to the temporary ARPA expansions because their family incomes were too low to qualify. You're not showing exactly why sometimes people aren't working, but if you don't have a fully refundable child tax credit, you have a situation where somebody gets hit, say, with a cancer diagnosis and then has to focus on their treatment, step away from work. We already don't have paid family medical leave in this country. We fall short on caregiving in general, and now we're going to say we're also going to take away your child tax credit or shrink it. Folks lose jobs all the time through no fault of their own. We've recognized that in the past, and it happens throughout the business cycle. Again, people might be students doing something to advance their prospects in the labor market while they have kids. And it makes little sense when, as Dr. Michelmore documented, it's actually those folks who are growing up in families with the lowest incomes where you're going to get the most bang for your buck.
Thank you. Senator Johnson, thank you for enduring that, and the floor is yours.
I got no choice.
Take as long as you want.
I appreciate that. Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, I'm new to the committee, new to the complexity of this issue. I think we've been in enough hearings now, you realize that my thrust always ends up being, the KISS principle, keep it simple.
Right.
And this is a classic example of it. We have so many different programs to try and alleviate poverty, And, one of the charts I used in an earlier hearing here is, prior to the war on poverty, we had poverty rates dropping precipitously from about 22% down to about the 15% range. And in the 50, 60 years since the war on poverty, we've spent about $23 trillion. It's pretty well flatlined. It's gone up and down a little bit, but we haven't conquered. We haven't won that war on poverty. I would argue part of the problem is simply the complexity. I mean, even this chart, I'm an accountant. I actually do understand numbers. It's like, I don't know how any working family or non-working family or any would even begin to comprehend what the incentives are. They'll just take what money they get. I would argue we ought to really focus entirely on simplifying what it is we're trying to do. And of course, the real challenge in any type of, we're a compassionate society. We want to help people that can't help themselves. We want to help people help themselves, right? The trick is, how do you design benefit programs that don't make people dependent on government, that don't encourage people to, we got, 20% of the adult working age male population permanently out of the workforce. That's not good for America. That's not good for them. That's certainly not going to solve poverty. So, Ms. Rashidi, or Dr. Rashidi, you were talking about the different programs. How many different programs do we have trying to help people? I mean, do we even know the number?
Well, we have tried to quantify it. There's actually 80-plus programs that are means tested.
Only 80?
Yeah, 80-plus, because it's a little bit hard to identify all of them. But yes, there are roughly 5 or 6 major programs that kind of account for the major expenditures that cover food, housing, and basic necessities.
Again, it's so difficult because it's, just single mom with one child. I mean, it's hard to come up with stock figures, but I don't know whether you're familiar with the work of former Senator Phil Gramm and John Early. They look at the income gap or the wealth gap, which, on its surface looks pretty dramatic, but then from the top earners, when you take away taxes, and from lower earners, when you add benefits, all of a sudden doesn't look quite that bad. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yes, that's very true. And actually, the CBO puts out great data on after-tax and transfer income, and it shows very different trends than if you're looking at pre-tax. It shows not only that the gap you described shrinks, but it shows that income, considering all benefits and after tax, has increased for those in the lowest income quintiles. So it's important to look at that after tax and transfer, because the federal government does provide a lot of transfer payments to low income households.
And again, these benefit programs are tax-free. I think we kind of lose that in the translation as well. In a budget hearing, this is many years ago, and when we were considering budget items as opposed to climate change most of the time, I remember we had I think the individual was in charge of the welfare system in Pennsylvania. And it was striking about his testimony, and these are just gross numbers, don't hold me to them, but he was describing a person in Pennsylvania who, for every additional dollar of work, she would make more money, up to about $30-some thousand worth of income, and then she would have to make something like $65,000 before she'd put an additional dollar in her pocket because of the drop in benefits versus, so again, is that called the welfare gap, or the benefit?
Benefit cliff.
Benefit cliff, yeah. That's a significant problem, and you're talking about earned income tax credit versus this child tax credit, just the complexity of all this stuff. I would argue what we really ought, as opposed to just focusing on child tax credit and all these studies that are produce different results based on time frames. Again, your head just starts swimming the complexity, and I don't think you can really draw any conclusions to it. I would argue what the Finance Committee and what this subcommittee ought to do is take a look at these benefit programs in total. What can we do to simplify them to accomplish the goal that we all agree on, is how do we help people help themselves? How do we help people that can't help themselves? How can we make sure that children don't live in poverty? How can we actually win the war on poverty? Because we're not doing it, and we've spent trillions of dollars. And I would argue, one of the biggest problems for people in poverty is that a dollar they held at the start of this administration is now worth less than 86 cents. And it's kind of hard to develop programs that make up for that damage, which is caused by massive deficit spending. And what are we massively deficit spending on? programs that make no sense. That, again, there is no way a human being can understand exactly how they ought to maneuver to take best advantage of this. I mean, it's just impossible. So, I mean, I'm sorry, I appreciate all your scholarship here, but I mean, I listen to these studies and my head just swims. Mr. Corinth, or Dr. Corinth, you want to comment on this at all?
Sure. I would just note, in terms of trends in poverty, you're exactly right. If you look at the official poverty measure, we've made no progress. That said, if you include all of the benefits that we pay out, we have made a lot of progress in reducing poverty over time. The only problem is that it's come through government transfers as opposed to self-sufficiency. And actually, in the 90s, when we had welfare reform, we not only saw poverty falling, we also saw self-sufficiency growing. So we can do both. You can both increase work, increase self-sufficiency, and reduce poverty. You just need programs that encourage work, like the existing child tax credit and the EITC.
So one of the results of what you just said there, what we ought to do is take a look at these, how we calculate poverty, and we ought to build into that, the value of the benefits. So we're actually looking at, because again, I think that's okay. And most Americans say, fine, great, if we've reduced poverty and these people are getting benefits, great, but I'll go back to my main point. How do you provide those types of benefits without encouraging dependency and, what actually does long-term solve poverty? People work, plus providing people the dignity of earning their own success as opposed to just being dependent on government. So anyway, I think these are extremely interesting hearings. I don't understand most of it. I don't think most people understand most of it, and I'd like to understand it. So that's what I would, just yesterday in budget hearing, I said the same thing. We were talking about Social Security. I said, let's have some round tables where we can have full discussions, where we're not talking by each other, and start fixing these problems, because we're not fixing them.
Yeah, and I'll take that as a start. I mean, at least this isn't a boring hearing. Most of the hearings around here are pretty boring. So thank you for that. And I would say just a little bit of a reaction to what you're saying. One place I think where it's pretty clear that we've done a good job on poverty, not as good as I would want, but a good job on poverty, is Social Security, and what the poverty rate for seniors would look like if we didn't have that program in place. That's something that actually has worked, and I think that was very much on my mind when we were crafting the child tax credit. Simplicity, that was very much on my mind when we were crafting the child tax credit, because unlike a billion other programs that this committee or this Congress writes in its wisdom to try to make America's life better, what we said is let parents make the decision about how to spend this money.
So the problem with Social Security is it was a concept that made sense, but when we extracted those payments out of people's wages, we didn't put that money into account for them. We spent it. The money's gone.
Yeah.
Had we actually put that into real assets, I've done the spreadsheet on this, we'd literally have $6 trillion of hard assets that the Social Security Administration could call on, as opposed to those government bonds that have no value to a government agency. Right. You've got to borrow more money for that. So, but that's we couldn't even get that out yesterday in that budget hearing. So again, what I'm encouraging is
that's another.
This kind of dialogue in a kind of round table, as opposed to standard hearing where we get 5 minutes worth of questioning, where we can really vet these issues, then rely on experts to tell us when we're either full of it or, no, that's about right. So we need to have, and I think in a public setting too, not just in closed doors, but we need a public setting where we have these discussions and both sides get to talk with each other as opposed to past each other.
And I think that's great. And you mentioned something that I think is really important as well, which is the persistent, chronic, rate of numbers of people, in America who are not today working. The system that we have is a system, the system we have, not the system with the child tax credit, the system that we have, our workforce participation rate is actually lower in America today than it is in every single one of these countries that has a child allowance. Where people have the opportunity to be able to get a little bit of an incremental bump to their income to stay at work, to pay for a little extra child care, to pay for, for a little bit of extra after-school program. I've met kids parents in Colorado Springs who are telling me about how their expanded child tax credit had enabled them to pay for a bicycle so that their kid could stay at an after-school program in the springs so they could stay at work. And if they didn't, if they had to go pick that kid up, and for me, the thing about this, I think, Senator Johnson, is that, you know, having been the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, a school district where most of the kids are kids living in poverty in this country, where most of the kids, most of their parents, whatever these studies say about anything, I will assure you that the people in that school district are working. They're working 2 and 3 jobs in many cases. They're not lazy, they're not, and I know you're not saying that, they're not working. That's not the problem. They're working at jobs in the richest country in the world that pay them so little that no matter how hard they work, they cannot lift their kids out of poverty. And I will say, I'll turn it over to you, I will say a huge part of that is because this is not the 1990s in America anymore. A huge part of that is if you look, and I've got a slide we can talk about later, if you look at, you know, the economic expansions from the 1930s until today, what you will see, and especially from the 1980s until today, what you will see is that people's incomes in America have flatlined for 50 years unless you are on the top 0.1, top 1, top 5, top 10, top 20, a little bit for the people in the bottom of the top 20. For everybody else, it has absolutely flatlined, especially for the people living in poverty. And that is a reason why I would argue that we face the stubborn problem that we face. It's not just this issue of government programs. In fact, I think much more important than that, it's that we have had an economy that where the people at the very top have benefited with every period of economic growth, and people in the rest of the economy, including not just poor people, but people in the middle class, have been flatlining, so that for them, this is indisputable, for them, economic recoveries since the early 1980s have been recessions, not economic recovery.
And this may surprise you to hear this, but I agree with you. And you know how rare right now this exchange is in this kind of setting, and it shouldn't be. You know, you were on a school board, okay? I was on the Partners Education Council in Oshkosh, and I sat with some of the most liberal college professors and the most conservative business people. The politics never came up because we were concerned about what we could do to improve the education of our children. The same thing here. There are so many more things that unify us as a nation. I would argue right now that the greatest threat to this country is the division. And I tried to encourage Chairman Whitehouse yesterday to, okay, Social Security is really important. In that hearing, we're just talking by each other. So let's have a roundtable. His reaction was, well, until you guys lay your plan on the table, there's no point. Well, and I think, we lay a plan on the table and it'll just be attacked. It's not, there's just some basic truths or basic realities that we need to get on the table, agree on the facts, and these hearings are not, they don't work that well. So I would encourage you as chairman of this subcommittee, let's use this subcommittee as an example. Let's set up a roundtable. Let's bring in some experts to be as advisors, not necessarily provide testimony, but be as advisors as we discuss this over a series of meetings. And I think we will find far more areas of agreement and learn from each other. I just think it could maybe be a breakthrough in terms of how you can actually solve some of these problems. Again, I've done a lot of problem solving in the private sector. This place drives me nuts. No, it's just, again, we just don't approach this in a problem-solving process where you agree you've got a problem, identify the root cause. Compromise is actually the last part of the process. And what just doesn't work is, one side offers a proposal, the other side, diametrically opposed, and it just never gets solved, as opposed to let's focus on all the areas of agreement first, and then going through that problem-solving process, go, okay, now we start compromising on exactly how we ought to solve this problem, because again, there's differences in opinion from the witnesses here, but my guess is all of you want to alleviate child poverty. how's the best way to do it? And start discussing it. So again, what I'm proposing is a different process. And let's start at the subcommittee level. It doesn't seem like we'll achieve it at the front. I mean, you seem to be a person of goodwill. Let's start doing this.
Great. Well, thank you, Senator Johnson. I'll take that
Okay.
suggestion, and we can think about how to make it work. I do think, again, and I appreciate your agreement at the outset, which I was not expecting. I do think that a lot of what we're struggling with, you mentioned the divisions in America, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have had an economy, again, for 50 years that has not grown the way historically we've expected it to, where when it grows for everybody. And it is my view, I don't know whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong, but it is my view that that's when you lose democracies in human history.
You need a middle class. You
Exactly.
need a strong
People
middle class.
lose
And
a sense of opportunity.
It's not a good thing.
They can't move their families ahead. And you mentioned,
By the way, I've got a tax plan that would address that to a certain extent. I'd like to talk about that.
But
a true Warren Buffett tax.
You mentioned which is good because, folks like Warren Buffett should not be paying
I've got
less
the
in
solution.
taxes than his secretary. But on education, and I've got a couple questions I do want to ask these guys about priorities and spending. But,
I'm assuming that these folks are finding this very interesting.
well, I don't know if they are. They're probably not, because there's like my mom and my dad are watching me, and these knuckleheads on the committee won't shut up. So we will stop. But let me just say on education, though, because you raise it, and this is a place where I am just infuriated myself about Congress and about the federal government. We have had yet another, in the last month, we have had 2 sets of reports about what's happening to American kids. Oh, man, you have missed it. In the wake,
Now we'll return to regular order.
in the wake, the adult supervision has returned. But in the wake of COVID, and all of the educational loss that's happened, all of the, at least in my state, the mental health epidemic that's occurring among adolescents in America, and here we find ourselves once again posting horrendous academic outcomes for kids. We're failing on the latest NAEP stuff. We're failing on the latest other assessments. And, that's not a topic that ever comes up around here. Like what to do about
Yeah, we don't want to discuss our failures.
Well, we also, yeah. All right. Senator Thune, you're here at a
Thank you very
perfect
much, Mr.
moment.
Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. I appreciate the conversation. You're going to be able to put these folks back on TV with their moms and their dads and their families so they can
I'm
listen
guessing
to their
this
erudite
Is this a fairly
answers.
robust conversation
It's been
with
good. Positive.
our colleague from
Positive.
Wisconsin?
It's been good.
All right.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Corinth, and I'd like to start with you. In your testimony, you raised concerns with the validity of studies from the National Academy of Sciences and the Census Bureau touting the effectiveness of morphing the child tax credit into a child allowance. You also challenge the various studies that claim impressive results from the American Rescue Plan Act's changes to the credit, and particularly its impact on child poverty. Now, it's a lot to unpack, I realize, but could you expand on these issues, specifically outline the flaws or data gaps in each of these studies? And then, in addition, you note that you did your own simulation of what impact shifting the child tax credit into child allowance would have on employment and poverty. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about your findings as well as respond to arguments that your concerns are overstated?
Thank you. So quickly, the first study was the National Academy of Sciences study, and there it's very simple. They've failed to recognize that the child tax credit's work incentive was eliminated. When we fixed the error and applied all their other assumptions, you get 1.3 million people leaving the workforce. In terms of the 2021 studies, one of the problems is that lots of things were changing at the same time. So not only did we get the child allowance, we also had child care assistance being extended. We had vaccines being rolled out, schools opening up again. So it's very hard to isolate the effect of the child allowance as opposed to these other factors. And the other issue, of course, which I mentioned in my testimony, is that when you have a temporary 6-month policy change, it's going to be a lot different than how people would respond to a permanent change. And then finally, in terms of the study that my co-authors and I did, we were the first study to actually recognize and model the work incentive effects of this policy change. We also used by far the highest quality data set. We linked survey data with administrative tax records and government program data to get much more accurate incomes and to identify those people who were most likely to respond to the incentives. So when we use that higher quality data and actually recognize the work incentive changes, that's when we find that 1.5 million people would leave the workforce.
So, as you know, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that Congress passed in 2017 doubled that maximum child tax credit amount to $2,000, allowed most of it to continue to being refundable for those with sufficient earnings up to an inflation-adjusted cap, which is currently around $1,600. Under current law, this increased child tax credit will be cut in half if Congress doesn't act. So could you please speak to the importance of the child tax credit as it's currently structured and the benefit that it's providing to American families today?
Sure. So the existing child tax credit sort of has a triple bottom line. It encourages work, reduces poverty, and invests in the long-run success of children. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did a lot more than that, and it boosted economic growth, increasing wages across the spectrum. So I would say it's vitally important to make that permanent after 2025 when it'll otherwise expire.
Dr. Rashidi, in your testimony, you speak to how the American Rescue Plan temporarily revamped the child tax credit, and one of the changes that it made was paying it directly to individuals without any taxable income, thereby removing the historic incentive for credit beneficiaries to be working and turning it into, as we've talked about, a child allowance. Should the American Rescue Plan version of the child tax credit be resurrected, could you speak to some of the negative impacts, including impacts on workforce participation, that you would expect to see among those claiming the CTC?
Sure, thank you for the question. I do have concerns both about making it fully refundable for non-working households as well as eliminating the phase-in, which has the work incentive that Kevin is talking about. For the non-working families, I have concerns for a couple of reasons. One is we have a large body of evidence from the 90s, and I agree we're not in the 1990s, but I also don't want to return to the 1990s. And so the making the child tax credit available to non-working families would actually be a larger benefit to those non-working families than AFDC was in the 90s, and we know that that had very bad effects for families. And so I'm concerned about that. The other thing I'm concerned about for non-working families is currently we have a fairly robust social service system for those families in terms of SNAP, TANF, other benefits. When you turn that into a child allowance, it removes a touch point from the social service sector, and I have concerns about what's happening in households when there's no work in the household, and just kind of removing that touch point is concerning, I think, from a child perspective.
Well, and just to follow up on that, you pointed out in your testimony that there are these other federal programs that do not have a work requirement component and are therefore targeted at helping those who are unable to be employed for one reason or another. So could you just enumerate again or outline for this committee what some of those federal programs are and why paying the child tax credit to those without taxable income duplicates these other efforts and reduces the effectiveness of the child tax credit?
It very much duplicates this existing system that we have. We currently have temporary assistance for needy families, which is primarily targeted to non-working, mostly single mother families. It provides child care assistance, provides a lot of other support services. We have SNAP, which is formerly food stamps, also available to non-working families. So there's a fairly robust safety net that already exists for non-working families. So that's why a CTC with the phase-in, with the work incentives, that's only available to working families is such a positive policy because it encourages that work and it gives those non-working families the incentive to get into the labor market to provide them not only the opportunity to escape poverty, but also that employment will help them move up the income ladder.
So you referenced in your testimony this Penn-Wharton budget model that reviewed the American Rescue Plan CTC changes, and it found that the benefits of the changes are not targeted at those families in the lowest income brackets. So could you speak or if you could, broadly at least, to those distributional effects of the American Rescue Plan CCC changes on families in various income brackets, as well as the distributional effects of the advance payment specifically? I think there's an impression here that those changes did impact or distributed among people with lower incomes, families with lower incomes, and I'm curious as to what you have seen, while that was in effect, and maybe can speak to the distributional impacts of that change that was in place temporarily.
Yes, it's a good question. I mean, because the expansion of the child tax credit was so large and reached so high up the income scale, it was neither strictly an anti-poverty policy nor was it tax relief. It was kind of a mix of both. So if you think of the expanded child tax credit as necessary to reduce child poverty, it really isn't targeted well towards child poverty, because the Penn-Wharton model and even the data that we have on what families received the benefit, less than 50% was actually targeted in terms of expenditures, targeted to the bottom 2 quintiles of income, which means middle and higher income families got about half of those benefits. But that's a design choice. I think the perception is that because it was made fully refundable and went to non-working families, it was strictly an anti-poverty policy, and most of those benefits went to those households. But in reality, it was much more distributed across the income spectrum, and like I said, not really truly tax relief, but also not strictly an anti-poverty policy.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would say, simply in conclusion, that in my state of South Dakota right now, the unemployment rate is, if you can believe this, under 2%. And if, in fact, what you're saying and your analysis, Dr. Corinth, is accurate, and that is that we're going to lose, it's going to cost us over 1 million people who aren't going to go back into the workforce. We need people in the workforce. And if it's also true that, as Dr. Rashidi has pointed out, that the distributional effects of this do skew toward the upper end as well as to people in the lower income categories, it perhaps is keeping a number of people out of the workforce. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Thune. I'm going to defer to Senator Warren because she's here and it's her turn. But I would say that Dr. Rashidi's testimony, I think, confirms what's reality about the child tax credit, which is that it both is an anti-poverty measure and a measure targeted at America's middle class, and that's why you see the distribution. Unlike the Trump tax cuts, which I'll go through in a second after Senator Warren, where 52% of the benefit went to the top 5% of Americans. As Dr. Rashidi said, the 50%, just over 50%, of the tax credit that we put in place in 2021 went to the bottom 50% of Americans. That's true, and that was the design. So America, it does consistent choices, and we're going to have to make choices about whether we want to cut taxes for the wealthiest people in America again and expect it to trickle down to everybody else, or whether for once we're actually going to do something for working people and for people living in poverty. Senator, do you have something to respond? Do you want anything to say?
Well, no, I would just say,
because I don't want to leave you hanging.
The only thing I would say to that is, if you look at, again, and of course, it's surely when people are paying more, as a total, in totality, you're going to see more tax benefits, probably when I'm talking about volume, but when you're talking about percentages, what happened with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 is, in fact, if you look at who pays taxes, the burden, the tax burden, relative to what it was prior to 2017 and after, people with higher incomes ended up paying more, not less.
And I think the question, you and I actually had this debate. I don't know if you remember, but we had it back then. I will leave it for a moment, and we'll come back to it. Senator Warren, thank you for coming back, and please take the time you want.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So too many families walk a tightrope to try to make ends meet, and that is why Congress established the child tax credit, to try to help families pay for essentials like diapers and daycare. During the pandemic, Democrats increased the value of the CTC and expanded access to more low-income families. The result was one of the most effective anti-poverty programs ever. A record 3 million children lifted out of poverty, child poverty slashed in nearly half within the space of a year. But congressional Republicans continue to insist on what they call work requirements for the CTC and other critical programs. I call these unworkable requirements. This is an old trick of using a maze of red tape to deny families the help they need while not actually promoting employment. Now, Mr. Dutta-Gupta, you're the director of the Center for Law and Social Policy and an expert on poverty. So tell me, have work requirements, when applied to the CTC, to Medicaid, to SNAP, to TANF, whenever they've been applied, actually helped families find good jobs and escape poverty?
No. Data show that the CTC refundability doesn't stop parents from working. I just want to remind folks it's completely different than the old pre-TANF AFDC program. It does not phase out dollar for dollar at some point. You do not have less access to health coverage after a year as you did then. So look, the main effect here of work requirements is to make it harder for people to access benefits. Yeah. We tried this in Arkansas with Medicaid under the Trump administration, and there was no impact on employment, but they did kick 1 in 4 adults off of health coverage, even though 95% were either already working or qualified for an exemption.
So say that again. So they put work requirements in place, and the consequence was not to boost the number of people who were working at all, but you did lower the rolls of people who got the benefits that they were legally qualified for. And you said what portion lost their benefits?
1 in 4 adults.
1 in 4. So all of this red tape has not helped people find work, but it has cost millions of people the help that they need and wasted the time of millions more. And it's not just families that get buried under this mountain of paperwork. The government actually has to administer it, and that's not free. So, Mr. Dutta-Gupta, in addition to costing families their benefits, can you tell us a little bit about what work requirements actually cost the government?
Yes, you're right, Senator Warren. Administering these complex rules inevitably costs the government money. So, again, if we look at when the Trump administration tried to apply work requirements in Medicaid, the Georgetown Center for Children and Families estimated costs for states that were interested, or in the case of Arkansas actually implemented the program, and they found that the costs varied from tens of millions a year to hundreds of millions a year in just implementing the work requirements. So this is not a path toward simplifying.
Okay, so work requirements don't actually promote work, but they do cost millions of Americans benefits, and they cost the government hundreds of millions of dollars to administer. But there is one group that actually profits from these work requirements. Obviously not the government, it's obviously not the people who need the help, but instead it's the for-profit contractors who are hired to administer these programs. Maximus, for example, has contracts in more than half of the states to administer eligibility rules for Medicaid, SNAP, and TANF. And they have raked in billions of dollars, shoving families off their benefits if those families can't run through the maze. So, Mr. Dutta-Gupta, in your opinion, do work requirements help anyone besides the private contractors that get paid to administer them?
Overwhelmingly, no. They distract from a lot of the things that actually boost incomes, improve health, and other outcomes. We talk about the 90s often, the 96 welfare law. Well, we need to acknowledge the big boost in the earned income tax credit, child care spending, raising the minimum wage, running a tight labor market, all of which I think were much more effective. Yes, private contractors are paid millions of dollars to administer these programs and have been busy lobbying Congress and states to expand the requirements in order to increase demand for their services. That money could be far better spent directly supporting families.
I agree with you. We need to stay focused on policies that actually help struggling families and invest in our economy. And that means restoring an expanded child tax credit and opposing Republican efforts to try to tear another hole in America's safety net and use a maze of red tape that has been proven a failure every time it's been tried. Families need us to get this right, so I hope we can get this done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Warren, for being here and for your leadership. I also want to recognize now Senator Brown, who was the co-author of the American Family Act that we did write, Dr. Corinth, 2 years before the study that you've indicted here this morning, which didn't form any basis for that bill. But I do want to say that none of the progress that we would have made, if one considers it progress to cut childhood poverty almost in half, would have happened without the leadership of Senator Brown. And I want to thank him for that. On behalf of the kids in Colorado, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as you know, I share that credit with you, certainly in the work you've done. And we've been working on this for a lot of years. And I have said many times, and I know you concur, that the best day of my career was March 6, 2021, when I was sitting next to Senator Casey on the floor and turned to him and talked about that. We had a couple other things that mattered in that too, a pension bill too, but I remember after that, we all kind of teamed up and talked to Secretary Yellen after the president signed it, and he went to the IRS commissioner, a Trump appointee who was a professional and not only didn't stand in the way, but accelerated it by July of that year. By July of that year, the checks went out to 60 million, to families of 60 million children, 2 million in my state, 2 million in Pennsylvania, hundreds of thousands in Colorado. The child poverty rate dropped by 40%. Not quite immediately, but quickly, and it's the way government's supposed to run. We do something. We listened. We listened to people like you. We acted as a group. Senator Bennet was a real star in that, and we passed a bill. We made sure it was implemented. We got the administration to do it right, and look what happened. Unfortunately, we were not able to make it permanent. That's the mission I know the three of us on this panel are committed to. So. I'd start with Mr. Dutta-Gupta and Ms. Mitchell-Moore. You both mentioned in your testimony the research that tells us a permanently expanded CTC would cost taxpayers $97 billion per year, but it would generate literally 10 times that in annual economic stimulus via future earnings and tax contributions. And I love the back and forth between Senator Bennet and Senator Thune. I like Senator Thune. I just think he's colossally wrong when it comes to tax cuts for the rich, which do very little but shift the tax burden to the wrong people. But what Senator Bennet said about what this means, what the two of you, and I will let you answer in a second, what the two of you have said. We talk a lot about the cost. Conservatives talk about the cost. People that want tax cuts for the rich talk about the cost in this, never talk about the benefits. So tell us more about the cost-benefit analysis you mentioned, both of you, Mr. Dutta-Gupta and Ms. Mitchell-Moore, if you would.
Thank you for the question, Senator Brown. Yes, I'd be happy to talk about that. Some of my own work in this area, and I think from other mounting evidence, suggests that when kids get more income in childhood through tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit, they go on to have much higher earnings in adulthood. And so I think that's a big component of the benefits that have been calculated. They've also been shown to reduce health costs in the future and reduce costs through things like reducing crime.
Thank you, Mr. Duca.
And Senator Brown, first, thank you for your extraordinary leadership with Senator Bennet on this issue. I would just add that it also reduces interaction with the Child Protective Services, child welfare system. So we're keeping families together, which I think is hugely important. And we're talking about nearly 24 studies. And in many ways, we can actually isolate the impact of income itself as a transfer. And I think we have very good reason to believe in some ways that these estimates might even be conservative. So, I mean, just imagine, we talked about being in the private sector. If you could get a 9-to-1, 10-to-1 return on investment, how foolish would you be to not make that investment? This is an investment that only the United States can make, only the government can make.
and you think of the economic growth just overall and how that really is a case of lifting out all boats, not tax cuts for the rich, but directly investing in workers and the working poor and in the middle class and workers generally. One other thing I wanted to mention, Chair Bennet, he called this hearing in part to highlight the bipartisan history of CTC. I worked with Senator Cassidy, Republican from Louisiana. We worked on a number of things together. He sits on this committee on a temporary measure that strengthened CTC. During the pandemic, many families saw their wages take a hit because they got laid off or saw their hours cut. That in turn reflected the amount of their additional CTC. So Senator Cassidy and I got a bill passed that allowed families to use their 2019 wages instead of 2020 wages for purposes of CTC. We call it the look-back option. And again, we got it done bipartisanly. It had broad support here when families filed their taxes in 2021. Mr. Dutta-Gupta, tell us why this would be so important to working families if it became permanent law.
Yeah, Senator Brown, as you described, the tax credit look back really helps folks when they face a wage reduction or they lose their jobs, and they have the option of figuring out which year of income would give them the higher benefit. And this happened obviously a lot in the pandemic, but it happens all the time.
Yeah, let me interrupt and explore that. And sorry,
take whatever time you want.
Thank you,
Senator Brown, take whatever time.
Thank you.
You won't be the first.
I assume the people that benefit centrally and the most from the CTC are if in fact there is data on this, I would assume it, but are people whose incomes are more like this, right? That they are likely to pass in and out of good or better or worse jobs, likely to get laid off, likely to have their hours cut, likely to not have child care, so their hours are different. Is that probably generally right?
Yeah, we have good reason to believe that there's more income volatility at the very bottom of the income distribution, and the low-paid, low-wage labor market itself often treats workers, especially during an economic recession, as quite disposable. So I think that's right. I just want to add that one other thing that you've pushed for, full refundability, helps with this problem. For what full refundability says is, look, you may have lost hours on the job, you may have even lost your job, but we're not also going to cut the child tax credit. You at least have that floor. You don't have to then pull your kid out of after-school programs. You don't have to stop the music lessons. You don't have to cut back necessarily on the nutritious food you're providing. So the look-back option is a terrific option that you all enacted temporarily. And full refundability as well actually really helps with this challenge. It helps smooth incomes and people's consumption.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Very much appreciate your leadership here. Senator Casey.
I want to thank Senator Bennet for presiding over this hearing, and in a larger sense, thank him for his leadership on the child tax credit all these years, as well as Senator Brown, culminating in that moment when we passed the American Rescue Plan. The first vote, we had to have 2 votes over the course of about 3 weeks. The first vote passed at 5:34 in the morning. Not that I remember, but I remember the moment that passed. And we all appreciate what was done in the lead up to that over the many years before the American Rescue Plan. But in my judgment, the current child tax credit isn't enough for families. We should have the version that we enacted in the American Rescue Plan. Also, when I consider the last 40 years, this is my view of the last 40 years, the tax code's been rigged over and over and over again for big companies and very wealthy Americans. I think that's not just my view, I think it's the view of a lot of people. In the American Rescue Plan, with regard to the child tax credit provision, we finally said we're going to choose as a body, in this case the Senate, with a very limited vote on one side, but we got it passed. We're going to choose to help families who are trying to raise their children, trying to struggle through a pandemic. And we're not going to do anything in this bill for big companies and wealthy Americans. They've gotten a lot over those 40 years. So we made the right choice. But as much as we can talk about the data, you've heard the data over and over again, you've all testified and you bring great expertise. As much as we testify about the data, about the impact on families, some of it can't be measured in numbers. The impact of this tax credit on the lives of families and lives of children is literally immeasurable, incalculable. Here's just some examples of just a few examples in our state. Jim and Judy from Apollo, Pennsylvania, talked about using the tax credit for paying for medical and dental care. Kenya from Philadelphia talked about paying rent, feeding children, paying bills, buying shoes. A person from Scranton talked about eyeglasses for her children. Joy from Glenside talked about preschool and childcare, paying for that with the child tax credit. Stephanie from Glenrock, food on the table. Rebecca from Philadelphia, mortgage or food. And Lori from Orfield, Pennsylvania, paying for her daughter's dance classes, protecting her social and emotional health, and teaching her resiliency. You cannot measure that impact. There's no way that we can measure the positive impact that this had on people's lives. I sat with two mothers in the Lehigh Valley on the eastern side of our state. Two of them, between them, they had about, I think, 6 children, as I remember. Both of them said we can pay for school activities we could never afford before. How do you measure if a child could be in a science club or in a music? It was in some kind of a music after-school program, or an athletic endeavor of some kind. How do you measure that on the life of that child? And the problem is we should continue that. And so I wanted to start with you, Mr. Dutta-Gupta. You testified that there are also, you talked about the long-term benefits of the child tax credit. You said that EITC and CTC increases a child's test score by 6 to 9% of standard deviation. Tell me more about the long-term benefits. I wasn't here for your live testimony, so tell me more about the long-term benefits for children.
Yes, Senator Casey, children benefit in numerous ways that we have been able to measure, although I think you're exactly right that some of the impacts are really best understood through these stories. But they benefit with higher earnings as adults and improved health, as Dr. Mitchell-Moore also testified, including longevity. We have reason to believe that they live longer because of these sorts of investments. When children are exposed to these sorts of cash supports, they're also less likely to have children as teenagers or young adults, and they're more likely to complete higher levels of education. And in turn, we know they do better in the labor market.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know I'm almost out of time, but I don't want to go too far over my time because the chairman's been very patient with our time today. But last point I'll make is I know there was some debate here in the aftermath of the passage about the effect on jobs and somehow this would be a disincentive to work. Well, 2.2 million families in Pennsylvania, 2.2 million children, their families benefited in Pennsylvania. That's about 85% of the children in our state. We got about, I think it's 2.2 out of 2.6, if I remember correctly. So that passed, and yet today we have, I think, the lowest unemployment rate we've ever had. So I'm not sure that argument holds much water. But I think the one part that's missed in a lot of our states is my state is rural, at least by geography, but also substantial population. We've got about 3.5 million people who live in rural communities, 48 counties. And if I look at the list, and I'll just give you three or four examples. Here's in different geographic regions of the state: Crawford County, up just south of Erie in the northwestern Pennsylvania, rural county, 16,000 children. Fulton County, down by the Maryland border, a very small county, only has 14,000 people in it. 3,000 children benefited in Fulton County. Mifflin County, 9,000 children. It's a small population county, rural county, 9,000 children. Susquehanna County, up where I live, near Scranton, again, a rural county, not a big population, 7,000 children there. So this benefited children in low-income urban communities. small towns and rural areas disproportionately in a very positive way. But even in our suburban counties where sometimes people think families are better off, 70, 80% sometimes of those communities benefited as well. So, Mr. Chairman, I can't say more about the positive impact this had on people's lives in ways, as Mr. Dutta-Gupta just said, ways that are measurable and ways that are literally immeasurable. And I want to thank you for your ongoing leadership.
I want to thank you, Senator Casey. I mean, your description of the people that you're meeting in Pennsylvania is exactly the same as what I'm seeing in Colorado and what I saw when I was superintendent of the Denver Public Schools. The problem in America is not that people won't work. The problem in America is that we've had an economy for 50 years that has grown for the very wealthy. It's grown incredibly well for the wealthiest people in the country, and it has not grown for anybody else, including when we've had periods of economic growth, which, as I mentioned earlier, have actually been recessions for working people in this country. And I don't think any defender of capitalism can defend that set of outcomes. You know, I still believe we can create a capitalist economy in this country that when it grows for everybody. But that's what we have to do. And in the meantime, for people that just have a bare minimum expectation for what it is to have a middle-class life in America, you know, to be able to afford those a little bit, maybe a music lesson or some back-to-school clothes without, you know, being unable to pay the rent or be able to feed their family. You know, these are families that are not on the public dole. These are families that are working every day, a lot of times 2 and 3 jobs, you know, to be in a position to hope for the best for their kids. And I agree with you that you can't possibly quantify what the value is of that. You know, the family I mentioned earlier who bought a bicycle for their kids so they could stay at work and work a little extra time while their kid was there. But it's probably impossible to quantify the value to our nation, but, you know, we are living in a world now where we are the richest country in the world, and we have one of the highest rates of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. We don't have to accept that. That's what we showed when we passed this. Thanks for being here. There was some discussion earlier about distribution tables. There were some arguments that we should expand the Trump or extend the Trump tax cuts because of what it had done for the American economy. There was some complaint about the amount of money that had been spent on the child tax credit. I wanted to get into this question with Dr. Mitchell-Moore and Dr. Dutta-Gupta. How's that? Can I?
Excellent.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry that it's taken me that long to figure it out. But I do think that life, as Senator Johnson was saying, does consistent choices. I've been baffled by the choices that Congress has been making, been baffled by the choices that, you know, some colleagues on the other side have been making around when it comes to taxes, you know, why it's well, I'll read the question, and then I'll tell you why I think it's baffling. I just want to remind everybody about the Trump tax cuts. If they are extended, as Dr. Corinth said they should be, they're going to have an annual cost of $350 billion a year. Unpaid for. Not a dollar of that has been paid for. $350 billion a year. That is more than double what the expanded child tax credit and earned income tax credit from 2021 cost. The difference between these two things is that the Trump tax cut overwhelmingly, to a degree that's almost impossible to imagine or fathom, helped the wealthiest Americans while leaving pennies for low-income families. It is so hard to believe this that I hope people will pay attention to this, especially people who supported the Trump tax cuts and the idea that somehow it was a middle-class tax cut. As I mentioned earlier, when we were having the conversation with Dr. Rashidi, and I'll ask anybody who wants to refute these distribution tables, if they can refute these distribution tables, half of President Trump's tax cut went to the top 5% of Americans. Half. That's 7.5 million people out of a country of 330 million people, 7.5 million households to be precise, with an average income of almost $800,000. They got, because of the Trump tax cuts that some want to extend, they got a $150 billion tax cut from Donald Trump. At the same time, the bottom 40%, you'll see it over on that end where you've got the poorest 20% and the second 20%. The bottom 40%, that, unlike the top 5%, which was 7.5 million people, the bottom 40% is 63 million American households with an average income not of $800,000, but of $22,000. To come to Dr. Rashidi's point, those columns represent where we put half of our credit. The rest of the half goes into the other, by and large, other working people there. But those folks that were at the bottom, those little red lines at the bottom, they got 5% of the Bush tax cuts. The two lowest quintile groups in America got 5% of the benefit. The richest 5% got over 50%. None of it was paid for. I wish my colleagues were here to have this discussion right now. None of it was paid for. Life consists of choices, as people said. And when I go home to red parts of Colorado and blue parts of Colorado, and I take this distribution slide with me, they think that we've been smoking something that's now legal in Colorado, or worse. That's what they think. Can't believe it. You're going to see the economic distribution in America in a minute, but they know the last 50 years, since we began this trickle-down economics and this outsourcing to China and Southeast Asia, and they know that the people that have benefited from living in that global economy because of their education, and by the way, I hold nothing against them. More power to people that have succeeded in an economy that hasn't worked for most people. They have worked hard to earn what they have earned, but it is impossible to look at these slides and not realize the benefit that the last 50 years have accrued to them, and the lack of benefit that literally has accrued to everyone else in America. And when I go home and I describe this, people say the same thing Senator Johnson says, which is, this is so complicated, I'm not sure I understand it. And what I say is, okay, well, let me give you an example. This would be like if a mayor the Trump tax cuts would be like if a mayor in Denver or Durango or Grand Junction or Cortez or Greeley or Colorado Springs or Pueblo or Alamosa or Springfield. If any mayor, and by the way, those are Democratic places and Republican places, if any mayor said to their constituents, I am going to go borrow more money than we've ever borrowed before, and their constituents, being Coloradans, would say, that concerns me. I'm worried about that. Why are you're going to borrow more money than we've ever borrowed before? What are you going to do with that money? Are you going to invest in our schools? No. Are you going to invest, to combat the mental health epidemic that American children are facing as a result of COVID and the way social media has interacted with them? No. Are you going to invest in our water infrastructure, which we desperately need? Nope. Are you going to invest in our libraries, our roads, our bridges? No, no, no. What are you going to spend the money on that you're going to borrow all this money from our children to pay for? We are going to take more than 50% of it, and we're going to give it to the top 5% of taxpayers in the city and expect it to trickle down to everybody else. We're going to give it to the two richest neighborhoods in town and expect it's going to trickle down to everybody else. That is the set of values we're pursuing. We're going to borrow, we're not going to pay for it. We are going to borrow every single penny of that. And by the way, we're going to chastise people that try to do anything else for the people that are at the lower end. But we're going to borrow that money, send the benefit to the 2 richest neighborhoods, and hope somehow that's going to benefit the rest of us. That was Donald Trump's tax policy. I hate to say it, but it's true. The numbers don't lie. Those were what the numbers were. And let's remember, let's put this up, and Senator Whitehouse, I'm coming right to you after I ask this question. Let's remember the backdrop here, which I've been talking about all morning long. This slide goes from 1973 to the present, although you could take this all the way back to the Great Recession. And what it shows is that the top 1% of Americans, that's that red line at the very top, the 7.5 million wealthiest Americans are the ones that have seen the fastest income growth over that entire time. They've decoupled from everybody else. Everybody else almost has been flat. If you squint even harder, you see the top 100th of 1%, which is 25,000 Americans who benefited the most from the Donald Trump tax credits, President Trump tax credits, who our economy has reaped the biggest benefits on. This is a tragic story in our country, tragic. Between the First World War and 1980, average incomes grew from 4 to 5 million for the wealthiest folks. That's not a huge leap. But since 1980, these incomes have grown to an astonishing $32 million a year. That's an unimaginable amount of money. And life is about choices. President Trump made a choice to reward the wealthiest people among us, and he made a choice to leave the rest of America behind. That was his choice. They masqueraded, they made it look like there was a middle-class tax cut because they had a little bit of a tax cut there, but it was tiny in volume compared to what the rest of the credit looked like. And we made a significantly different choice in 2021. It's true, Dr. Rashidi. I think our choice was far more targeted than you are saying, and certainly far more targeted than the Trump tax cuts if your effort was to try to provide some relief to working people, if your effort was to provide some relief to the middle class. And we said, as you testified, half of the tax cuts to the 63 million poorest households. And it's a choice that I am happy to defend in red parts of Colorado and blue parts of Colorado. And let me just get out of the way of Senator Whitehouse. So actually, let me just say, could you compare Dr. Mitchell-Moore and Dr. Dutta-Gupta, could you compare the wisdom and long-term benefits of the expanded child tax credit versus the Trump tax cuts? And I'll come to you guys in a minute, but let me do this, and then we'll come to Senator Whitehouse, Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes, sir.
Yes. So the TCJA, or Trump tax cuts, as you pointed out, made a series of changes that mostly benefited middle and upper income households. And I will just note that your chart, if we could pull it back in time, you were right to say that the top decoupled, because actually from 1943 to really the post-war period, 1945 to 1973, all of those lines would have been growing together. And that stopped right around 1973. So this made particularly little sense in light of this long-term trend. But just to give an example, a full-time year-round minimum wage worker benefited with a $45 increase through the Trump tax laws, child tax credit changes, while somebody making $400,000 a year in a married couple could benefit, each of them have 2 kids, could benefit with a $4,000 increase. And I'm sorry, but it doesn't cost 9 or 10 times as much for a wealthier person to afford the same necessities for their kids. So this was absolutely a question of priorities, and the Trump tax law underscores exactly how we need to focus on refundable tax credits, particularly full refundability, if we want to deliver support to families through the tax code.
Dr. Mitchell-Moore, and then I'm coming right to you. You're in charge. I'm going to go to Senator Whitehouse, and then we'll come to you, Dr. Mitchell-Moore.
Thanks. We have a vote pending, and
Please,
I got
go ahead.
tangled in a complicated
Go ahead.
judiciary
No,
thing.
no.
I just wanted to make a brief point because I do have to get to the floor. In Rhode Island, we saw a test fire of the child tax credit, and it was a phenomenal success. It made a difference in people's lives. A woman from Crystal from Pawtucket said it helped when child support payments dropped below the mandated amount. I'm still in significant debt, but working remotely has allowed me to save on gas, and the amount that I receive from my teen allows me to put more money towards paying down that debt. So that's one experience, helped her work remotely. The other one was a woman who, from Providence, talked about her kids and her ability for them to, quote, purchase grocery, food, diapers, and baby formula. Diapers are very expensive, and child care, mark that, child care costs are soaring. I don't want my baby to go without. It's not the children's fault their parents are poor. All families need help, and it's time we start giving them the help they deserve. I understand that the argument has been proposed that by offering the child tax credit, we will encourage people to stay out of the workforce. In Rhode Island, our experience was exactly the opposite, and I think the logic of this is exactly the opposite. Child care is expensive. With a child tax credit, you can afford child care. Once you afford child care, you can show up in the workforce. Everybody I talk to when I visit employers in Rhode Island who are feeling workforce pressures says, if people could afford child care, it would help me solve my workforce problems because it would add to my workforce pool. So I just want to rebut that argument from Rhode Island's experience and just from a point of simple logic. And with that, let me turn it over to Senator Cortez Masto, and I understand that she now has the gavel.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. I couldn't agree more. As you all know, it is such an important game changer for so many families to have that support for many reasons. There's one question I have, though, and I'm going to direct it to Mr. Dutta-Gupta. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 denied the child tax credit to roughly 1 million low-income children in immigrant families. Who lack a Social Security number, even though their parents face payroll and other taxes on their income, right? And so my question to you is, these are some of the most in-need children in our country, and what is the long-term impact if these children are continued to be denied benefits?
Thank you for that question, Senator Cortez Masto, and for your leadership on this issue. Look, one of the goals of the child tax credit is to reduce child poverty, and any exclusions are going to harm children who are growing up in this country and who are going to live in this country by and large. So as you pointed out, it was up to 1 million children who were restricted because of this completely new requirement that was not in place before. Folks are paying taxes. Nobody doesn't pay taxes in the United States. You can't function without paying taxes. Mm-hmm. Sales taxes, property taxes, income taxes, federal, state and local often are more regressive. And remember, many of these children are part of mixed status immigrant families, which include U.S. citizen children as well. So the whole family can suffer. There's estimates that restoring access to these children currently being excluded can have an impact of up to $3.3 billion. As we discussed earlier before you joined, we know the child tax credit helps children do better in school, have better health outcomes, reduced interaction with the foster care system, reduced interaction with the criminal legal system, and do better as adults, including through more schooling and better.
But let me just say, for those reasons, do you see there should be a distinction between these children and other children?
No, they're children.
Right. And their parents are paying taxes, and just like you said, they come from mixed families, and they're in our communities. And so I can't stress this enough. I think all, because I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is such an important issue and area because we don't want to leave any of our children out. Clearly, there's more work to be done, and I, like my colleagues, support the child tax credit, and I think it has provided benefits. You all know it. You see the data. We see the data. It's there. But I do not think we should, quite honestly, distinguish amongst children just because they are immigrants or come from immigrant families. It's outrageous to me. So I thank you. And I don't know if you have any other comments around here, but this is really such an important issue for me because there's so many families across the country that have children that have been denied, which is outrageous, I think, on its own, that we are not really fighting for all of our children.
And it just adds one more layer, one more obstacle, one more administrative burden to folks. So look, at the end of the day, children are children. We don't have work requirements for attending public schools. And one day I hope we'll realize that a basic income is something every child deserves.
That's right. Thank you. Anybody have any other comments? Let me just ask, anything else that has not been addressed that you would like to put forward in the hearing that hasn't been asked? Yes.
Well, we talked a lot about the war on poverty, and I just wanted to say a little bit about that. So one of the misunderstandings about the war on poverty is this idea that it was about income transfers. Income transfers had very little to do with the war on poverty. The war on poverty was primarily about human capital and health care. So when we talk about how much we've spent since the war on poverty, it was almost entirely Medicare, Medicaid, and we did spend some on education and workforce. But what happened afterwards, we realized some of the error, and we have a Republican president, Richard Nixon, signing supplemental security income for folks with disabilities. We have a Republican president, Gerald Ford, signing the earned income tax credit. Then on a bipartisan basis, we've got the child tax credit, and so on and so forth. But if there was any failure in the war on poverty, it was that it did not try to address the underlying economic structure, systems, rules, policies, and it did not do enough on transfers.
Thank you. Let me just say thank you to our witnesses for providing your incredible perspectives today. I want to say thank you to the chairman and ranking member Thune for their partnership in hosting this important hearing, and to all my fellow members that were here. We would ask that any additional statements or questions they may have for the record be submitted to the committee clerk by within 5 business days from today, or 5 p.m. next Thursday, July 20th, 2023. And I will say the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.